Perfect. Well, great to be back in the JTA lab with you, Johnny, for the third or maybe fourth episode of JTA Labs, we'll see, in the center of Porto. Here with our founder, Jonathan Tully, and talking about a very important person when it comes down to not only the history of computing, but honestly, arguably, the history of the 20th century in general, and that is Alan Turing. Would love to get your thoughts on not only his legacy, but before sort of diving into the impact he had on AI, cybersecurity, computing, quite the resume. You have a very amazing personal connection to Turing, his team, and Bletchley Park. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I can. It's not, really anything too wild, but it is funny how, in the world they talk about degrees of separation and, are we close to people? And I only found out about this story, actually, only very few years ago.
Good timing for today.
Good timing for today. But, and that's actually down to something I'll mention. What was incredible about what happened at Bletchley Park was the just total secrecy that they were so humble. They had done this amazing work, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But nobody really, blew their trumpet. They all kept so quiet about it. Anyway, the story was, it was 1983, and I was leaving school and going to university to study maths. And one of the foremost universities for mathematics in the UK, I believe still is Exeter University. And the head of the department was a guy called Dr. David Rees. And I went for my interview, and actually his wife, Joan, worked there as a lecturer, and she did my interview. She was wonderful, charming, great interview, by the way. She brought in a piece of string, and she just tied the string into a loop. And we started talking about areas and how to manipulate the string and how could you form that into I think it was a bit of nonsense really, but she just wanted to see would I follow logic, would I grasp what she was trying to say, or perhaps she might say a problem and would I reformulate it?
How do you think?
Which was something that I may have picked up from Turing. Because what I learned in later life was actually that her husband, the head of department, Dr. David Rees, actually ran Hut 6 at Bletchley Park.
It's unbelievable.
And he did his doctorate under Gordon Welshman, who was, if you've seen that film, The Imitation Game, I think most people have seen it. Absolutely. He's one of the main kind of protagonists there, and one of the geniuses. And actually, I will say that Alan Turing gets an awful lot of the limelight about what happened at Bletchley, but Welshman and the others, they were all, equally deserved, like you do. You always say at JTA, it's always a team when it's not about the individual.
That's amazing. It's funny, the degrees of separation, very close, and here we are today.
So there we are, and I was thinking about it the other day, because I actually tend now to do, I rarely do interviews at JTA, but I sort of do it in the same way that Joan did to me. And did Joan do that because of something that she picked up from working with Turing? It's
absolutely,
you just don't know. But the funny story, I'll just do this very, very quickly. She told me that, she said, well, actually my husband's about to retire. And she said, but I don't know if I'm looking forward to his retirement, because he's bought himself one of these newfangled PC micros, and he's trying to learn how to program in BASIC. And she said, I come home and he's got steam coming out of his ears because he's so frustrated with the machine.
For sure.
And then when I found out about this story, I thought, goodness me, this is a man who actually saw the bomb machines being made. He would have seen Colossus being built, which was one of the very first VAL computers. He was right there at the birth of computing. But then in his retirement, he's got a newfangled kind of PC, and he's trying to teach himself BASIC. I just love that story. It's just such a human story.
Ongoing quest for learning and...
Yeah. But I'm also interested in Alan because he's a Brit, as I am. He's a mathematician, as I think I can call myself a mathematician,
I think
just.
it's fair to say.
He was a homosexual, as I am. Born in London, as I was. There's touch points there. I can kind of imagine his life with a degree of clarity.
For sure.
Because I lived a similar life.
Absolutely. And it brings to a great point, just sort of thinking about imagining his life and the context of his time, which I think make his achievements even more impressive in terms of laying the foundations of computing from a theory perspective and so many other things. But he didn't really live in a time when there was exactly a bunch of Azure credits lying around or data centers packed with GPUs. Can you tell me a little bit about the context of his time and why that makes his achievements even more impressive?
I only really thought about this quite recently, but reading some history books recently, I realized that Alan Turing was actually born at a time where, if you like, there was a void. There were no computers, but there was an amazing demand for computing numbers. And I think, an example that, I thought about was the First World War. He was too young. The First World War, he would only have been 6 years old when it ended, but it used a lot of artillery and heavy artillery. And those sort of guns, it's not just a sort of point and press firing a mortar at your enemy. Would you believe things like the rotation of the Earth actually have an effect on a shell?
Yeah.
The temperature of the shell when you put it in dictates how it will behave, perhaps slightly altering the friction with the barrel, the wind direction, the wind speed, all of this, so many factors that if you want to hit your enemy with a certain degree of accuracy, you need to do a lot of calculations. And back in the day, of course, on a battlefield, you couldn't have a mobile phone or anything like that. So they used to take paperwork with them, books and books and books of correction factors and things to, set up their equipment. And it reminded me actually that I had this at home.
Oh, wow.
And so this thing here, Godfrey and Siddon's four-figure table. So this is a kind of thing that, you see this, look at this. This is not good bedtime reading because it is just pages and pages and pages of numbers.
Yeah.
And I was, believe it or not, I was actually taught how to use this. Everyone was. It was on our curriculum at school because calculators only came out when I first joined school. Probably about the third year of my secondary school. So you couldn't just say, what's the sign, press the sign button. You actually had to look it up in tables.
For sure.
So really calculators and computers weren't around when I was a kid. So this was absolutely normal, having everything tabulated. And they would have done that in the war. But the other thing that, just as a kind of, I also remembered, how do these numbers get calculated? And they used to have teams of people doing calculations. And I've had this at home forever. My father used to work in an insurance company, and their actuaries, actuarial departments, used to use machines like this. It weighs a ton. It looks a bit like an Enigma machine, or a cash register, and you can put numbers in, and then you do your calculations by cranking the handle, and it goes round. It doesn't want to go round today, but it's got jam, but there you go. This thing would have been reams of people just sort of working on these to do these sort of calculations. Error prone, yes. Horribly inefficient, absolutely, you betcha. Need to calculate tables with thousands and thousands of numbers, huge need. It's strategically important to your war effort. So this was the sort of the setting, if you like. And it kind of got worse, actually, during the Second World War. Wars do amazing things to create innovation. I was watching a program recently about the bomber force, and they said that the night they used to go over at night, and something like 98% of the bombs dropped were further than 5 miles away from their intended target. So everything was a miss.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the war, though, everything was a hit. And it was because they actually invented things like radars. The bombers could actually, even though there was no light, a radar screen could show them features of the ground and things like that. All of that, of course, needed fantastic,
For sure.
innovation and compute to an extent.
Definitely.
So yeah, it was a very interesting time that Alan came in.
Huge urgency, to your point, in terms of wartime efforts, and pretty amazing. And thank you for bringing that in to think about the context of World War I, manually calculating tables, context of trench warfare, the mud and whatnot, and just the importance of what he brought to the table in World War II.
Yeah.
But before getting to World War II, where he made some of his most notable contributions, if you think about the Imitation Game movie and whatnot, he did some pretty amazing things as a very young man in his Cambridge days, I believe. And it seemed that he had a real disruptor streak in him. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of how the notion of the Turing machine came about and how that sort of was prompted by his sort of challenger instinct with the legendary German mathematician David Hilbert and the decision problem?
I mean, I wasn't there, but I've got a bit of a theory about how that kind of came about. And back in the day, with a little bit before Turing's time, there were no computers, of course, but mathematicians thought, well, if we're ever going to be able to make a computer, we need to kind of understand it from a theoretical point of view.
Right.
So there was a lot of theory that was being put together and papers. And David Hilbert had thought, I think he called it the deciding problem. Could a computer decide? And this problem had not been solved. Well, of course, as you say, I think Turing could be a bit of a disruptor. And I'm pretty sure he thought, all these amazing, famous mathematicians have not solved this problem, so I'm going to do it.
In his early 20s.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
But this is a recurring theme, but I love it, and it's a very mathematician thing to do. I think Turing sort of said, the decision problem, can something be decided? What is a decision? What's a big decision? What's a small decision? What's a good one? What's a bad one? It's such a ethereal sort of concept. You can't really tie it down. So one of the first things he did, which is very clever and makes perfect sense, he said, really that question that you're asking is equivalent to another question, which is, if you give a computer this program and all of this data, will it actually be able to come to a conclusion? Will it stop? Or will it sit in this infinite loop of uncertainty and never come to a stop? Of course, this is so much easier problem to solve mathematically, because define, did it stop? Well, the answer is yes or no. It's not like a decision where good decision, bad decision, where is it on a scale? It's yes or no.
For sure.
And so he did something that we see again and again. He turned the problem on its head to reformulate the problem to be something that is more easy to solve. And I suspect that's actually how he had so much success with things like Enigma.
For sure.
Anyway, he did come up with a proof that there's no way, even with the most super powerful computer, which didn't exist in his time, but if, let's say, it could have been invented, you can say to a machine, here's the data I'm going to give to this program, will it stop? It is completely impossible for something to decide. And he did it in a very clever way. He just imagined there was a program that makes that decision, yes, something will stop, or it won't stop. But then he asked that program to sort of pass an opinion on itself, and it would say, well, I'm going to stop, because I always say yes or no, which is a stop. So I'm going to stop. And he said, well, what if we then just put a couple of lines on the end of that program that say, like an infinite loop? Well, suddenly there's a paradox, because that program would then say, of course I stop, I say yes or no, but wait a minute. If I say yes, I suddenly go into an infinite loop. So I've said I'm going to stop, but I don't stop. And so he'd created this paradox. And that is actually a common mathematical technique that we use for formal proofs. That if you can start off with an assumption, I assume that this can be done, and then you make perfectly defensible, logical arguments, and then you come to a complete contradiction or a paradox, you know your initial assumption was wrong. That's the way that logic works. And that was great. He'd answered this long time problem that lots of mathematicians have been grappling with. And I actually like this problem now, because if I said this to some of the young folks I know, they'd probably think, well, that's a bit of a non-event sort of problem. Does it stop or doesn't it stop? But I think these mathematicians have never seen a computer.
For sure.
But all humans now have been in that situation where we've got our spreadsheet, we've done an hour of work, we've forgotten to save it, and suddenly the mouse stops moving.
Spinning wheel of death.
The spinning wheel, exactly. And then we're all thinking, if I press reset, I've lost the last hour of work, but will it stop? So do I go and get a coffee? How long do I leave it before I press the reset?
Seems to never do.
We've all gone through
Totally.
that. And so something that he was grappling with from a very formal kind of mathematical point of view, all people on the planet now have an innate sense of
100%.
what that actually feels like.
Totally. It never seems to stop.
that wheel.
You always have to reset.
You always have to reset. So, yeah, which is very funny. But yeah, that I mean, has actually serious implications, joking apart, in things like cryptography and all sorts of things.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting NIST article I think we were looking at, and NIST is sort of like the cryptography, cybersecurity standards of the world in a lot of ways, and they were doing a tribute article to Turing, I think on what would have been his 100th birthday.
Oh,
and
nice.
to your point around the contribution to cryptography and cybersecurity, this notion of will something stop and when will it stop is really important to protecting our data, is sort of what they were saying. Will something stop in a second? Will the program be solved in 10 years? Or will the sun flare up and burn up the earth in 3 to 5 billion years? And a lot of that kind of notion of whether something can be solved in that window of time or halt in that window of time seemingly makes up a lot of the cryptography standards that we have today, which is amazing.
Absolutely. They just added an extra wrinkle, the mathematicians. Cryptography, I can explain in a second. It's basically an algorithm that is remarkably fast one way, encrypting. You put in your password, it's instantly encrypted. But to your point, to go the other way, to decrypt your password, would the sun have exploded and swallowed up the earth? It couldn't take billions and billions of years of processing. So they just took that, does it stop and doesn't it stop, to make a kind of a two-way feature. Brilliant. That's cryptography
Based on
in
the
a
simplest
nutshell.
of ideas, though.
Simplest of ideas.
Yeah, amazing. One of his many legacies and lasting impacts. But going from sort of his work on the decision problem and cracking that, and how that sort of led to this notion of the Turing machine, again, another major impact in terms of long-term computer programming and sort of the universal standards of computing today, this notion of, is it Turing complete, if you will. Can you tell me a little bit about the Turing machine and its architectural components, like the strip of tape? Again, talking about a simple idea that has manifested throughout the decades and had an everlasting impact.
So, I think our young Alan is working on the halting problem. And of course, as I said, he really likes to define everything as a mathematician. So he made this definition, the halting, the stopping, is it yes or no? But of course there's a big problem, which is when you formulate a problem, does a computer stop or not? How do you define a computer? He's thinking, well, what is a computer? And he thought, how can I strip this bare to a really concise, almost, well, actually it can be, a mathematical construct, and say, that is a computer, which we now call the Turing machine. And again, I love the human part of this, because like most people thinking of a problem, he probably thought, well, if I give someone a problem, let me give you a piece of paper. What's 22 plus 39? And someone will actually write down 2, 2, 3, 9. So what's 9 plus 2? Okay, I've got to do a carry and with a pencil. And he thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And he made a few observations. First of all, the paper. Humans like to write from right to left and down. He said, well, we don't need to write that way. We could just write on an infinitely long piece of tape. So we don't actually need, let's cut out the up and down bit. Let's just go right to left and write things down. And then people are using logic. It's sort of, well, if I've got to do a carry, then I need to do something else. But if it's something like 2 plus 2 is 4, there's no carry, then obviously that means I do something else. So there's this really strong concept of logic that if there's something on my piece of paper, then I need to do something else. And he thought, well, how do I do that? And at its simplest form, a Turing machine, it's a tape, and it has an eye, or a head, I think they call it, because it does more than see. It recognizes symbols on the tape, but it can erase those symbols and it can write. So it's like the human's pencil, perhaps with an eraser on the back, so that it's, again, he's thought about this, the person, and then that's essentially the machine. And his program, if I can call it program, is a set of logic, so that he'll say something like, is the tape blank? Yes. Okay. Move along to the right. Is it blank? Yes. Move along to the... Oh, there's a number there. Okay. Is it a 1? Yeah. Okay. Go to a set of instructions that deal with 1s. Or if it was a 2, go to a block of instructions that deal with 2s. And then it'll say, move to the right. And so you see this idea of the instructions are simply, if it is something, it might then say, change what's on the tape, and then you move to the right or move to the left. So his computer only had those terrifically simple questions. And it's almost mind-boggling, because you think, well, that computer won't be able to do much. But he provided a set of instructions that would add numbers. Well, if you can add numbers, then you can subtract, because it's really just addition in reverse. And if you can add numbers, then you can repeatedly add, which is multiplication. And if you can do multiplication, we'd already proved many, hundreds of years before that complex concepts like trigonometric functions, sines and cosines, can actually be calculated by repeated multiplications and divisions, a lot of them. So he actually wrote that his machine, although it was just this terribly simple thing, he showed that, yes, it could compute pi. It'll be able to calculate the number pi, and he would show how this, worked. So it was amazing. He'd actually invented a computer that it was just this idea of a tape and an eye and a pen and a few logic statements. But he proved that it can actually compute anything.
That's amazing. And I guess the strip of tape today is pretty much the chip or the hard drive or the memory in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. It's brilliant, because a memory bank, RAM, random access memory, is really just locations on the tape. Now, in the Turing machine, he could only move right or left, because he wanted to keep everything terribly simple for him to analyze from a mathematical standpoint. Of course, nowadays, we don't go to the memory and say, let's keep moving through till we find we have this concept of an address, so that a computer program will say, what's in address 200, or what's in address 0, or it makes it faster. But it's not doing anything logically different from the Turing machine. We can just get to it faster because we've added addressing. our chips, we add things like we use logic gates to create adders. You can create, this is one actually here. When I was at school, we had a computer that had no chips in it. It only worked from transistors. And one of my ambitions is to rebuild one as a retirement project. So this is actually how they did it. These are little logic modules, and these are NAND gates, and these are transistors. So this is stuff that existed. Actually, this computer would have been designed right at the end of Turing's life, but about the time that unfortunately he passed away, was when this design was being put together. And this is it can add and subtract, and is then the computer that we had could actually multiply and divide by actually doing that repeatedly. But this board does this for 1 bit. And the computer had 18 bits, so it would have 18 of these boards. So, that would be something like that. And then there was a rack of other boards that did things like the clock pulses and the input and the output. But it was very compact. It was actually quite a small... At the end, the thing had about the size of a photocopier. And that was a typical 1960s computer.
It's amazing, and a great example of his legacy in terms of laying out the blueprint of computing, again, with the simplest ideas, just like cryptography and the halting problem and whatnot. It's pretty amazing. And speaking of sort of impact and redefining things, which is a real through line to your point with Turing in terms of his disruptor streak, but just looking at the problem differently and trying to break it down to its simplest form is probably the most famous example, the Enigma cipher and his contributions in World War II, which many historians have said probably shortened the war by 2 years. Think about the countless lives that saved. It's pretty amazing. But before getting into how he redefined the Enigma code problem and breaking that, what was the Enigma code to begin with in terms of the challenge and the scale of the challenge of what he had to break?
When you're a kid, you might send a message to your friend and you code it, and you basically, we've all done it. You say, well, I'm going to, instead of writing an A, I'll write a T, and instead of writing a B, I'll write a D. You just change the letters. You replace a letter by, and if your friend knows that replacement, you can encode and decode. It's the simplest of codes. And the Enigma machine kind of did that. These are terribly easy to break, though, because cryptographers know the frequency of letters in a language. So if you saw in a piece of code lots of T's, that was the most frequent character, you'd probably think, well, that's got to be a vowel, because in language, vowels are more frequent than consonants, and it's most likely to be an E. In the English language, E's, and I think actually in the German language as well, E's are more prevalent. So you could have a stab at it. It's not a great thing. Enigma machine, though, was genius in that it had these rotors, and the rotors would also make a substitution. So A would go to S. But the rotors were mechanical and they'd click round. So the next time you put in an A, it might go to a P, and then the rotor would click round. And so the next time you put in it, so with an Enigma machine, you could just say, my message is A, and it would give a string of letters, every one of them completely different. So it blew out of the water this idea of frequency analysis. To give you some scale, those 3 rotors actually only had about 17,000 combinations, which isn't huge. But the substitution of one letter by another has something like 150 million combinations. But then the 3 rotors that they put in the machine weren't always the same. They had a box with other rotors. And anyway, the whole thing, when you put it all together, had 159 million combinations. So it's a big problem.
Yeah.
In fact, the other day, I thought, let's imagine that we could test one of the settings every second. test a setting, test a setting, test a setting. How long would it go? Well, I got such a big number. I thought, oh, how am I going to kind of visualize this? So I thought, well, I know a big number, and that is the age of the universe. Scientists can gauge from the expansion of the universe pretty accurately, we think, how long the universe has existed. So I thought, well, let me compare the time that's required to the age of the universe. Is it a fraction of that time? Well, it wasn't a fraction of that time. It was a multiple of that time. So it will take longer than the age of the universe. And do you know how much longer? 300 million times the age of the universe.
And he had to solve it every day in 24 hours.
Yeah, and that's right. His problem was because every day the codes were changed, and finding out about something that was going to happen that day, 5 days afterwards, well, it would have already have happened. It was not an option.
Unbelievable. And to that notion in terms of trying to tackle a problem that you can't even really wrap your head around in terms of its immense scale, how did he kind of redefine that, and how did something like his idea of the weather report win the Allies the war?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, I will say that, we always talk about Alan Turing in this context, but he was building on incredible work that had been done, actually visionary work that started in Poland. And the Polish authorities were aware that Germany could become a threat. And so they were watching what they were doing with Enigma before the war had even started. And so there was a body of information. And I believe actually before Germany invaded Poland, there was a lot of exchange between the UK and Poland, so that the mathematicians in Poland were saying, look, we've come this far, this is what we've done, and you might need this information. So, there were other giants who had really put a lot of effort in.
Sure.
And of course, Turing worked in a team. But to answer your question, the problem seems impossible, but there are weaknesses, and Turing and his team understood and documented those weaknesses, and then worked out how to use those as an attack to make a seemingly completely impossible problem become eminently manageable. First weakness, as you said, weather report. They became aware that there was a sort of machinery to war. Mundane things need to be done every day. There would be folks whose job was to measure, look at the weather. You don't want to start an attack if there's going to be a pouring rain, or if you can't fly because of fog or whatever it might be. It's very important to the war. And so yes, somewhere there would be a transmission that comes through that would maybe have the words weather report. That was a real standard one. The words Heil Hitler, often, someone would do that. But one of the things I also liked was the radio listeners in the UK got really attuned to, I didn't realise this, but everything was sent in Morse code, in dots and dashes. But apparently, when you learn to tap out your dots and dashes, people have slight differences in the sort of hesitation or is it the musicality of do they leave a slight gap between letters, and experienced radio operators can actually tell, oh, that's Fred on the end there, or they didn't know who it was, but they could give them names. And that might also provide information that would help you know, because when they heard that particular, if they knew that, oh, that's the guy who does the weather, so weather report is more likely to be in this one than in this one, because I don't know who that is. Maybe that's from a ship. Because no one knows where these messages are being picked up from radio. dash, 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 and they don't know where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. But they had clever ways of working on that. So that was great. And then the fundamental flaw was that a letter on an Enigma machine is never encoded as itself. And so if you have a code and you think, I'm guessing the word weather report's going to be in there, mm-hmm. and you look and you put weather report next to your code, if there are two letters, one letter converts to itself, it cannot be there. So you can quickly sort of look through, and if you get to a point where there's actually no clashes, no letters are the same, that might be weather report. Mm-hmm. And mathematically, a clash will occur one time out of 26 mm-hmm. letters. So there's this factor which is 25 over 26, which is 0.9 something, mm-hmm. probably 0.9593 something, I don't know. So what that's telling you is there's only a 7% chance with one letter that you kind of get it right. But as that word that you're looking for, weather, is longer, weather report for the Bay of Biscay, mm-hmm. they get bigger and bigger. If you can find there's no clash, that factor of 0.9 becomes 0.8, 0.7, 0.6. As you mm-hmm. add more letters, mm-hmm. it becomes so that they might say, I've actually found a piece of text that's so long, it is 95% likely that is the text. There's only statistically a 5% chance that this is a fluke, mm-hmm. and it could have been a fluke. Mm-hmm. But if you've got something, you say, right, well, I know with 95% certainty that this is the original text and this is the encryption, bingo, you've mm-hmm. got yourself a great big clue.
That's amazing. Almost reminds me of like modern day natural language processing and trying to find the needle in the haystack and search and whatnot. It's amazing. And I love the notion, to your point, of the people operating the radios and their incredible domain knowledge and expertise in terms of picking up, oh, maybe that's Fred based on the frequencies and whatnot is a really great example. And something still important today when you think about how important domain expertise and experience is in projecting when training an AI model. For instance, if you think about training a model to detect disease, having the best doctors project their expertise and managing that in ongoing ways is critical. So it's another interesting example from history and how that continues to manifest today.
Absolutely.
But speaking of sort of AI, wanted to ask you about another major impact, because we've talked about cryptography, the war effort, the blueprint for computing, so he certainly achieved a lot, but he's also very famous for, and still very relevant today, for the Turing Test, which is sort of the holy grail of assessing AI's capability, at least for the last 60 years. And recently, things like ChatGPT have been able to pass certain versions of the Turing Test, which is really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about the Turing Test, this notion of the imitation game, and what that really means and why it's still so important today?
It's another one of those examples of him sort of rewriting, rethinking. Once there was this general idea that an electronic computer, mechanical computer, a machine could be built to compute, and we understood what compute was. People immediately, of course, started asking the question, well, can one day computers think? But of course the mathematician in him would just like the word decision. Think? What's think? Are we saying, will it have a high IQ, a low IQ? He said, this is impossible to answer. Mm-hmm. Remember what he did with the decision? He turned it to a yes, no. Will it stop? Yes, no. So he thought, how can I rephrase that expression, will a computer one day ever think? He said, you're asking the wrong question. Let's do this. Let's imagine a game where we have human beings and they can send text messages, which didn't exist in those days, but he kind of postulated that might be possible, send maybe handwritten notes to two booths. And a person is in this booth and a computer is in that booth. And you start to have a conversation. And what he said was the question you really should be asking is, will one day it be possible to have a conversation with a human and a computer, and a human being will not be able to detect the difference?
Amazing.
That's how you ask the question. So he turned it on its head.
For sure.
And yeah, as you say now, amazingly, yes, computer AI, computer science has got to the point where I think it's very difficult for us to know if we're talking to a machine or
For sure.
a person. The Turing Test has been reached. But again, as I say, I just love the idea that you're asking the wrong question. I need to turn that on its head.
Absolutely. So important today with AI accelerating so quickly. People think about AGI, and there's so many different definitions of what that means. So it's another example of his enduring legacy to say, let's define things, let's actually think about them in a different way. So pretty incredible person, and we could spend a lot of time talking about his incredible contributions and his team as well, to your point, in terms of everyone at Bletchley Park and whatnot. But thank you so much. I'm sure we can do a follow-up at some point for sure, because
I'd love to do, because this is absolutely fascinating, some of this
totally.
stuff.
And I need to see this in action at some point as well.
I will get you working on this. Maybe we could film that and do a blooper.
Sounds good. There'll certainly be a blooper if it's me on it, less so if it's you. Thank you, Johnny.